In 1972, Kodak released 110 Instamatic film, 9 years after having released 126 film. Both of these were aimed at the amateur market, providing an ease of use and eliminating the requirement to thread the leader of a film into a film spool on the other side, the take-up spool, and then advance 2 frames, etc., etc. Instead, you simply dropped one of these cartridges into the camera, wound until you reach number 1, and at which point you were ready to take photographs. Much like 126, 110 film brought with it a series of cameras. Most were simple cameras with fixed focus lenses, although some did have advanced features, such as rangefinders and meters, built-in meters. And there were a couple that went above and beyond, and we'll take a look at one of them, or actually 2 of them today, from one camera manufacturer. 110 film, I believe, is roughly equivalent to 16 millimeters. From what I've read, it was about half the size of normal 35 millimeter film, and 16 millimeter films is, well, not quite half the size. It's slightly under, but you get the idea. The resulting negative was rather small, and I think that was probably one of the limitations of the 110 film format, the size of the negative and the fact that the image was probably going to be fairly grainy. The 2 cameras that we'll be looking at are the Minolta 110 Zoom SLR and the Minolta 110 Zoom SLR Mark II. They're both very different in their visual appearance and in operation. However, they do share some similarities. So let's take a quick look at each of these cameras. This was the original camera, obviously, because the other one's named Mark II. So this is the original Minolta 110 Zoom SLR. This was released in 1976, and you're going to notice this little lettering here with SLR. And that's rather reminiscent of the title credits on Star Wars. I don't know if that was intentional or if it was planned long before the release of Star Wars. Hard to say. This is primarily a plastic SLR with some metal built into it. On the top deck, the features mostly are pretty well marked. This has a small hump for your pentaprism, or at least I believe it's a pentaprism. On this side, on the right side, as you look down on the camera, is a small switch to either lock the shutter or unlock it. Here's your shutter release. And it has a small little inset here so you could thread a cable release to it. This was, I don't know if that's a battery check button. We'll try that. We'll put some batteries in to find out. Here's the hot shoe. Takes a traditional electronic flash. And here is your selector dial. You had 3 choices. You either had automatic exposure, X, which would be for flash synchronization. From what I've read, that was 1/150th of a second. And B for bulb. On the end, you had your tripod socket. Now that's a bit unusual because you would expect that the tripod socket would be down here, but in fact it's here, meaning for most people when they put it on the tripod socket, it would sit vertically. That's a bit unusual, and just a bit unusual. So if you wanted to then take a landscape photo, you would have to rotate it so it sits this way. Which is odd because now, because of the shape of the camera, it tends to put more stress on it. This little switch dials in exposure compensation, and it was either plus or minus 2 stops. There you go. This selected the aperture that you wanted to use, and apertures ran from 4.5 to f16. This also affected the light meter. The light meter eyes were behind here. I believe this used a cadmium sulfide meter, which in 1976 was still being used pretty widely. Very likely what would happen is as you change the aperture, it began to restrict the amount of light entering each of these small little portals. This is a 2-touch zoom lens, and it zooms from 25 to 50. And if you consider this is half the size of 35 millimeter, 25 would be roughly normal to 100 millimeters. So However, it's possible this gave you maybe a slightly wide-angle view and to a slightly telephoto view. Your focusing ring is up front. There are no serrations, and the aluminum barrel is rather smooth, so you do have to get a positive grip on it. On the bottom of the camera is your film advance. It's a single-stroke film advance, but the travel is rather short, and it's not difficult to advance a film. There's no need to advance the film in small increments because it's such a small, well, it's an Instamatic also. Here's your film door, and here's your eyepiece. There's a small little switch here next to the eyepiece. This is not an eyepiece blind. What it does is it opens up the door for you to load film. Now, notice how I did that wrong. To open up the door to load the film, you push that to the right, and then you pull down. And you'll notice the whole thing opens. Drop in your film cartridge. It's really simple, as Instamatic was intended to be. You simply advance this. Once it reaches 1, your film advance will lock, return to position, and you're ready to take your first photograph. Here's the name of the camera maker. Most of these cameras you'll find with its lens hood. And it was a fairly standard, collapsible lens shade. There we go. So when you're ready to use the camera, you simply pulled it out into its shade position, and when you were finished, you could just collapse it, and it would no longer be in the way. Now, this, as I mentioned, this camera took 2 S76 batteries, or 2 button cells. We'll pop some batteries in here now to take a look at it. So to open the battery door, as I mentioned, you simply pull down. There's a little black arrow here. You open your battery door and you put in your arrows. Be aware of the orientation: plus side up on one side, minus side up on the other side. Push that down, slide that into place, and it will lock. This is a battery check button. When you push down on it, there will be a little red arrow in your viewfinder to the right of the viewfinder that lights up. Most of the time, you're probably going to just shoot this on automatic. So in order to switch it from any of these 3 positions, you have to push in the silver button while rotating the dial. You could either as one-handed, or you could do it as a two-handed affair. Whatever works. Let's go to my board and talk about this viewfinder. So inside the viewfinder, it's fairly basic. You have a ground glass screen, and then in the center you have, I believe it's a coarse microprism. To the right, you just have 2 arrows. You have a red arrow, and then you have an orange arrow. So the red arrow, when facing inward, if it lights up, that means you have sufficient light to take a photograph. If the orange arrow lights and it's pointing to the right, that means you don't have enough light. You should probably either use a tripod or a flash unit. Note that you can still take a photo. This camera used a metal, well, I don't know if it was metal, but it was a horizontally traveling focal plane shutter, which is fairly advanced for a camera this small. So this is a series of small little prisms. And so what you'll find when you focus is that when things are out of focus, whatever is in the center here tends to sparkle. When it is in focus, it will stop sparkling. And that's the best way I could describe it. The view through this I think is fairly dim. Even in good sunlight, it can be difficult to focus correctly. Well, this really demands that you hold the camera pretty much one way. Index finger on the shutter release, and then you could cradle it in your left hand and turn the focusing ring, or if you wanted to, I suppose you could do it this way. Whatever's easiest. You'll notice that this does have a macro mode. So how this works is you pull the ring toward the back of the camera and you rotate it to the left, until this orange mark is on M and this downward arrow is lined up with the hash mark. What's unique about this camera is that when you move this to macro focusing, it actually slides a small lens element into place behind the lens itself. That's how you are able to focus closely. It's not that this provides more extended focusing. It really slides a small element in place behind the main lens. So the original Minolta 110 Zoom SLR went on sale in 1976. By 1979, things had moved ahead, and Minolta then introduced the Mark II. And these two cameras couldn't be more visually different, both in how they operate and much of their functionality. Whereas the previous lens had a range of 25 to 50 millimeters, this has a range from 25 to 67 millimeters. So it was still the same on the wide end, but it had a bit more telephoto reach. Once again, this was a two-touch zoom lens, one ring for zooming the lens or setting the zoom or the magnification, and the other ring for focusing the lens. This had a rubber focusing ring, which actually made it easier to grip, obviously. And this camera also came with its own rubber lens shade. Let's take a quick look around this camera and look at its primary features. This has a large selection dial, and it's sort of the same as the other one in that you have automatic, synchronization, and bulb. However, you did have a fourth position, which was lock, and that would lock the shutter release. So that was always good to have because that prevented accidental activation of the meter, and as well, it also prevented you from accidentally taking a photograph. Here was your aperture selection dial. So if you recall, the other one had that small ring on the front. Here it's on the left side of the top deck of the camera. This is also where you change your exposure compensation via a lift and turn ring. So once again, it was fairly difficult to do, so you probably wouldn't accidentally dial in exposure compensation. On the back of the camera, you had a switch, and this switch did not open the back. Instead, it put a small blind in place in the viewfinder. And that was if you had the camera mounted on a tripod, it would prevent stray light from entering the viewfinder and thereby influencing the exposure meter. I believe this probably used silicon blue by that time. Cadmium sulfide meters had sort of going out the door, although it was still in use by several camera makers. This had a little accessory grip that you could bolt on, or you could remove. It was a pretty tight in camera, and I have to say that the small grip that was provided, I believe it was provided, I don't believe it was an additional cost, I believe it was provided with the camera, is actually pretty useful and does help you hold the camera. Keep in mind this is a fairly small camera, so it's really almost, well, I guess you could make it a it's really only a 2-finger, so you really don't have any place for your pinky. But with it being such a small camera, it's no surprise. Here's your back release. In this case, you push upward, and the back pops open. Once again, drop in your film cartridge, close it. Your film advances on the bottom. Let's switch this to X real quick. This camera was entirely battery dependent. So you could not release the shutter without batteries. In the original Minolta 110 Zoom SLR, you could release the shutter on the flash synchronization speed, but that would be it. The other two speeds did not work without batteries. Before I insert the batteries, you did have a tripod socket. However, it was not in line with the center of the lens. Maybe there's some gearing in here that prevented Minolta from putting it there. But once again, because of the size of the camera, it probably wasn't a big deal. And the camera was more compact this way. This had small indicators to show you which way to orient the batteries when you put them into the camera. So in this case, plus side up in the holder and plus side down when inserted into the camera. As always, use either silver oxide or lithium batteries, and avoid, if possible, using alkaline batteries in a camera. This had small little lugs, but as you can tell, it was very front weighted. And so when you did have this on a neck strap, you could see that it really wanted to tip forward in a very significant manner. This small slide is a diopter adjustment, and you can see how it moves, actually moves the eyepiece either to and fro. Here's your battery check button, and here's your self-timer. So you would push it this is on lock. So you would push it to the far right to expose this little red dot, and then that would be self-timer. To check the battery, simply push to the left. And you can see that's sprung, so it doesn't stay pushed to the left. This had a traditional hot shoe, and as you can tell, this has an extra pin, meaning that there was, in fact, a dedicated flash unit. However, I didn't buy it, and I probably won't. Up top here, there's this small switch. This also offered macro capabilities. So in order to make that work, it's very difficult to see, but there's a small upward arrow. You push up and then to the left. You'll know you're in macro mode because it has a small orange indicator. And you probably cannot see this, but like the other camera, this slides a lens into place behind the main lens. And that is how it achieves macro focus. One thing that's different between the two, when you're in macro mode with this camera, you cannot change the zoom, right? You're just fixed at whatever focal length that happens to be, and it's probably 25 millimeters. With this camera, you still have the full zoom range available, and the close focus distance is very, very impressive. You'll get best performance at the widest setting, and I would say that the close focus distance is about this much, because I just checked. Like the Minolta X cameras, XD, XG cameras, you'll notice that the shutter release ring and this exposure compensation and aperture selection dial very much resemble those that were used on Minolta's newer cameras, the X series. That would be the XG, and XD. In fact, I would guess that they're probably identical, and the reason being that it's always easier to use existing parts rather than create new parts. When you're on lock, you don't have to push in this white button to move it off to A. And if you notice, they put A right next to L, which made the most sense, because that way, if you did have the camera locked, you could just simply turn it and you're ready to shoot. To select any of the other two, either X or B, you would have to push in that white button and turn the dial at the same time. This used, as far as I can tell, a very similar shutter, possibly identical. Put it on B. You know, I think I'm wrong about that. Yes, I believe that I had said that this uses identical shutter, but this seems to be a vertically traveling, once again, plastic, or perhaps this one is metal. In any case, it's a vertically traveling shutter. So that's somewhat impressive. This has a hood, a hump here to make room for the pentaprism, small pentaprism. That gives you a laterally correct and vertically correct image in the viewfinder. The viewfinder in this camera is much more advanced than the other camera. And once again, we'll go to my board. Okay, so the viewfinder in this camera has this central circle, but instead it has a split image. This split image makes it very, very easy to focus. And I would say that the difference between the image in this particular camera and the original camera is markedly different. I would select this camera every time. Over here to the side are some shutter speeds: 1000, 500, 250, 125, 60, and then there's a hash mark, and then there's 4. Actually, it's a little dot, and then there's 4. I don't know if 4 represents 4 seconds or 1/4 of a second. In any case, it's a fairly wide range for a 110 camera. If you think about it, it's still using just Instamatic film. So fairly impressive. When you slightly depress the shutter release, an LED will light up, and it will light up next to one of these. In some cases, it will light up 2, indicating that whatever shutter speed you selected is whatever shutter speed the camera wants to use is probably between these two. So it's aperture priority auto exposure. Actually, they both are aperture priority auto exposure, with this one giving you a real indication of what shutter speed is being used at the time. So this is a fairly advanced camera. I would guess that this also goes down to 4 seconds simply because the original camera had that same range from 1/1000th of a second down to 4 seconds. So let's take a quick look and see what these cameras weigh. So the original Minolta 110 zoom SLR with its lens shade, weighs 15 ounces, 15.1 ounces. And the Mark II camera weighs, well, let's put its lens shade on. That way it's sort of equal to the other, with them both having lens shades. 1 pound, 1 ounces. So there's a small difference. You could even say 1 pound, 1.5. If you want to round up, you could always make it 2 ounces. So there's a very small difference of 15, what is that? About 2 ounces. Fairly negligible, I think you could argue. 2 ounces isn't going to make much difference. Design-wise, this probably, each of them sort of reflect their era, right? So when this arrived in 1976, this probably was seen as, sort of hip, sort of interesting, and that was about it. When this arrived in 1979, this was a much more serious-looking camera. And, it had sort of the professional-looking dials on top. It was all black, of course. And I think it just resembled more of an SLR. This looks like more of a concept project. Not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just that, a different style camera. I've shot with both cameras, and I can tell you the Mark II is much easier to use. And it's not so much about the shape of the camera as it is with the addition of the split image focusing aid in the viewfinder. That's really what made the camera easier to use. Plus the viewfinder is brighter than the original camera. So the next question is, what do you do about film? Luckily, 110 film is still widely available thanks to Lomography, and I'll put a link to their website, or in fact, I'll put a link to where you can purchase the film. I have several rolls of the black and white. I don't remember the cost. I bought this several years ago. But because it's black and white, you can just process this at home. I have a couple of developing processing tanks that will take this, and the one that I know will fit this is a GAF film developing tank. More on that some other day. And there we have 2 advanced 110 cameras, each representing a slightly different take on advanced photography for the Instamatic format. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you'd like to see me cover a camera in a future video, let me know in comments below or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. In the meantime, keep on taking photographs.